Have you heard that saying that if your lettuce doesn't grow, that you need to fix the soil, not blame the lettuce? My name's Jodie Thornton, and I want to talk about how I don't like the way a lot of people are applying this quote to parenting. So if we think about the intention of people applying this quote, is what they're basically saying is that when we as parents or we as society create certain circumstances for children, we shouldn't blame the children for not being able to do better. So whether that means behave better or if, for example, society expects children to behave when they're not developmentally ready to behave in that way, or we are setting an emotional tone that is highly strong and then our children are highly strong. Like there's all these kinds of really recognizing that it's not our children's fault what is going on in their world. And I agree with that piece. However, I want to unpack a little bit of this mentality. Now, a big caveat to say, if you read the whole quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, it's actually really well written. So the whole quote talks about really understanding what is going on in the soil and what is impacting the lettuce. And so I think if you read the entire quote, it actually makes a lot of sense from a parenting perspective. But where I see it misused or misunderstood in a parenting perspective is when people just take the piece where it's like, if the lettuce doesn't grow, you don't blame the lettuce, right? Now, the reason I don't like this perspective is because I think it encourages us to think of our children as if you put all the right ingredients in, you will get something predictable out, right? Now, my first concern is what is the something predictable that we're expecting, right? When we think about our children as lettuces, and I know we don't really, but I want to just really unpack this because I think it's woven in a lot of parenting advice, is this idea that we have a predetermined expectation of what a child should come out like. So with lettuces, all of the lettuces are the same, I don't know what the plant word is for breed, but anyways, the same type of lettuce. They will all come out the same, right? And if they're not coming out the same, then there's something in the soil to be fixed. Now, children are not something where if you get it right? If you get it right, you will get out something that looks like it should. Right? This is part of my issue with it, is like both of the get it right and also what are you expecting out? Because what we really want to expect from our parenting is not that we will be able to get an A+ report card for you did all of the right things. What we want is for our parenting to continue. In my view, we want our parenting to continue for our entire lives. What we want is for our children to be continuing to seek out our advice because it's good advice. What we want is children to be able to express their own emotions, to actually understand them in the first place, to be able to hold boundaries with people they need to be able to hold boundaries with, to be able to create healthy relationships. So actually, when we look at it, it's very different to like a lettuce, because even if we look at all of those things as like a tick sheet of like, these are the things we want out of our parenting experience, what one child with one particular personality in one set of circumstances will need in order to achieve that, or how they will prioritize that in their lives, is actually not a standard thing. It is very different for a child who's an extrovert to be able to hold boundaries than a child who's an introvert. It's very different for a child who is naturally focused on the mechanics of how things work. It's very different for that child to understand how other people are feeling than a child who is more fascinated with the inner workings of people, right? It's so different, and there's different levels of interest, and there's a certain level of skill set that our children will need in order to be able to be happy and healthy. But beyond that, each different skill, our children are able to put in the amount of effort into becoming masters of those skills that suits them. Right? What do they want to prioritize in their lives? And this actually starts from a lot younger of an age than people realize. I think this is part of this mentality that I see throughout the parenting advice, which may just be because I am a part of that field, is that there's this idea that you can get it right, and what happens for your child is kind of like beyond your control. And I don't think we want to control our children, but what we want to be able to do is have a feedback loop. We want to be able to see, is this child comfortable with the boundaries they set with other people? Is the reason that they're comfortable with those boundaries because those boundaries are very tall and very strong and very inflexible? They feel perfectly safe, but they're missing out on key parts of their lives. They're a little bit afraid to make a change, right? Those are two very different circumstances. And how do you know that? You cannot know it from the outside. You cannot look at any person, child or adult, you cannot look from the outside and judge how comfortable they are with the boundaries they set in their lives, how comfortable they are with the amount of vulnerability they have. We can project, we can guess, right? We can see sometimes when people are uncomfortable with their boundaries. But if someone looks really strong in their boundaries, how are you to know whether those boundaries are serving that person or not? You cannot from the outside. You just cannot. And so this is where I think when we think about this idea that we are the soil and our children are the lettuce, it also leads us to be thinking about if anything is going wrong, it's our fault and something to be fixed within us. Now, we all know there are things that on our side of the fence that can be addressed. So, for example, if we are missing certain emotional or communication skills, if we have unhealed baggage that we don't know how to handle in such of a way that it impacts our children, of course that impacts your children. But as a good example, if your child is struggling with a short temper, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's because you are struggling with your short temper. It may be that your child is having a short temper because they do not know how to get their needs met. And you having a better temper, like you having better strategies to manage your temper or to not have that intense feelings in the first place, will not change whether your child knows how to get their needs met or not. If your child wants their sibling playtime to be more fair, right? Yes, if you have a temper and you're getting short with your children when they don't play nicely, or you get short with your children when they are not walking away when they get upset, like, yes, absolutely, that does make it worse. But ultimately, you resolving your triggers is not going to change your child's level of skill of being able to ask for what they need, be curious about and considerate of what the other person requires, and to be able to come up with solutions. And a lot of people will argue that if you just manage your triggers, that your child will have more space to learn. In theory, that is true, but I think it's like, I mean, if you think about everything that all of us do in life, what area of life do we say, I will not get any advice from anyone who's done it before? Absolutely, yes, we need to try new things, but for most of us, no matter whether we're doing things in our professional lives or our personal lives, we will often look for what has already been learned about this subject, right? And so when we think about our skill set from our children, we want to make sure that we're coming at this from a place of, we're not just leaving them in a sink or swim and like, take as long as you need to learn how to swim. What we're doing is saying, what skills do you need and how can I teach those to you? And I think that's another part. So this first part was about recognizing that your children have individual personalities. They have autonomy and choice of their own selves, that we can't put the right thing in and then get the right thing out. Neither of those things exist. The right thing in and the right thing out, they just don't exist. And then thirdly, this piece around it, we really need to understand that our children need to develop those skills themselves. Like, it is not all, there's a lot of parenting advice these days that defaults to it is the parent's fault. And absolutely, yes, we have a lot of opportunity that we as parents, the vast majority of us, are not taking up, but only because A, we haven't been taught it, but B, there are other forces at play here. Like, if we think about this, how many people do you know that have all of the circumstances that would make it easy for them to be the best parent that they would like to be? Let's think about what that would include. Economic circumstances, trauma circumstances, community connection circumstances, health, like can they afford the housing and the safety that they need? Like many of us have varying levels of privilege and varying levels of access to getting all these needs met. And so if we think about it from like a capitalist lens, is that everything comes down to it is the individual's fault and the individual's responsibility. If you cannot afford to eat, that is not my problem, right? When we think about this from a parenting perspective, it's always this idea of if something's going wrong with a child, it's definitely the parent's fault. Sometimes you'll get it's because the parents aren't on the same page, which is usually code for either, both parents are in the wrong because they should have gotten the other parent on the right page, or code for the dominant parent, usually the feminine aligned parent, the more feminine aligned parent. It's their responsibility to make sure that both parents are on the same page. You might get somebody saying, well, of course, because they're being influenced by those children at daycare or those children at school or the cousins or the grandparents. But when we look at what would influence everything for our children, the number one thing is their skills. The number one thing is their emotional skill set, their communication skill set, and their baggage handling skill set. Now, that doesn't get taught very many places, but also it's not focused on. What we focus on is it must be something wrong with the parent. And then we just feed into that parental guilt. It's my fault because I can't be consistent. It's my fault because I have triggers. It's my fault because of my childhood trauma. All of these things, not only are they unfairly squared at your feet, but also what they do is they give like a certain sense of hopelessness. It's like, I'm doing the best that I can. I can't do better than what I am. When actually, if we think about this from a skills perspective, we absolutely can, all of us, even if we have very little time, even if we have very little access to economic privilege, we can learn the skills that we weren't raised with. And so I really want to, this is where I think this lettuce analogy, even though on the surface it is true, it feeds into this idea that we should not pay attention to our children's perspective, we should pay attention to our own perspective, that we should always assume that we are somehow faulty, there's something wrong with us, we're defective as parents. And it feeds into this sense of like, we just need to do the best that we can, we need to just work harder and smarter and just withstand our triggers and all of these things. And none of this really is the fastest way to get to a point where your child is growing into their full self. And so I hope that this has been really helpful to see things from just like a different lens and really understanding that the full quote from Thich Nhat Hanh is actually really lovely and wonderful, but the way it's being applied in the parenting space, I don't think is very, I don't think it's conducive to the best possible outcomes we can get for our parenting. If you would like to talk to understand more about how you would apply gentle parenting principles in a way that respects your child's autonomy, that respects your child's individuality, that respects your individuality, and that takes account of the circumstances that you're in, I have a webinar called Gentle Parenting in Reality, and you can register for that at jodithornton.com/reality. In that webinar, we're going to go through like, what can you do if you don't have you and your partner on the same page? So maybe it's your ex, or maybe it's your partner, or maybe you don't have a second parent on the scene. But in any case, you don't have another parent that's on the same page. You don't have the luxury of hours and hours and hours to spend following, or even reading up on and following, these ones that say you just keep holding space and then just hope it works at some point. If your child is not gentle childing, or if your triggers are getting in the way of you being able to follow through on your intentions in parenting, we're going to talk about how we can really view all of these things in a way that makes gentle parenting achievable and practical no matter where you're starting from. So that in that webinar, I'll give you a really good understanding of the principles and how we can apply them no matter what's going on in our lives. My name's Jodie Thornton. If you have any questions about this at all, please do reach out. I would love to hear from you.